Howdy, Immortalium here, and today I'm going to be reviewing the complete series of Parasyte, a series that has been around for a decent amount of time. It was originally serialized from the late 1980s to the mid 1990s, but has only really gained popularity in the West due to an anime adaptation that was released recently. I myself have been interested in picking up the series for a while now. I remember putting the first volume of this into my wish list back in 2012, but at the time it was out of print. I was unable to get my hands on it, and it wasn't until the anime adaptation came out that Kodansha decided to reprint the series. So let's start off with, what the plot is. So what is the plot of Parasyte? Well, surprise, surprise, it's about these creatures who, for lack of a better term, are called parasites. So basically the way the story opens up, there's these kind of sporish things that come down from the atmosphere. We are kind of told that they originated on Earth, but we're not exactly sure where. Anyway, these spores come down, and when they hit the ground, they hatch open, and these little wormy creatures that are the parasites come out and take over nearby living hosts, generally humans. What they do is they enter into the body, they work their way up to the head, they consume the head, and then they replace the head with themselves. They essentially become the head. They're able to morph their body, which is their head, into various weapons, into like slicing skin things, a really big open mouth, so that they can consume huge amounts of meat and flesh at a time. And basically their goal is to consume whatever species they've taken over. So for example, near the beginning of the series, there is actually a dog that is taken over by a parasite, and that dog's entire purpose now is to consume other dogs. But in general, it's the humans that the parasites go for, and therefore parasites consume other humans. That is their food source. Now, our lead character, Shinichi Izumi, almost falls prey to the parasites. He almost becomes a parasite himself, or I should say consumed by the parasite. But when this parasite enters into his arm, he actually takes this, I'm not exactly sure how to describe it, like a string or whatever, ties around his body to prevent the parasite from going up. So instead, the parasite actually consumes his arm and becomes his arm. Because of the fact that he consumed his right arm, the parasite calls himself, I should say that Shinichi actually calls the parasite Migi. Migi being the Japanese for right. So, his right hand or right arm. That's how the story begins. How did I think of the story overall? In general, I would say that the story is good. I thought that there was a lot of very interesting ideas that are thrown about in it. In particular, about the fact that parasites are the natural predators of humans, and that the reason that they may have evolved is in order to deal with the fact that the humans are suffering from an enormous population growth, like a population explosion, and that if it continues on at this rate, the Earth won't stand a chance of being able to sustain so many life forms. So the parasite's essential goal is to cut down this human population in order to make it more sustainable for the Earth. Now, there's a lot of kind of philosophical discussions on this between Shinichi and Migi. And I gotta say that these philosophical discussions, while they're not overly deep, they never get really into the nitty-gritty, they're still very thoughtful, thought-provoking. They definitely made me think a lot about, how, the population explosion of humans is pretty much unsustainable, and, in the future, it's going to be very difficult for, the planet in order to sustain such a vast population, and it's going to have to be sorted out one way or another, whether that is, moving to other planets or whatever. There's lots of revelations about these parasites, about who they are. What's quite interesting is that near the beginning of the story, since they've just essentially been quote-unquote born, they're very animalistic, they just follow their instincts, but as time goes on, they start to develop more thoughts, more plans, etc., etc., and they start to develop a kind of a society which they use to, be able to organize their, human consumption easier, and to make it less noticeable for, the human population. The other thing, I guess, maybe I didn't make this too clear before, but parasites are able to, replicate the human face. It's almost impossible to tell, who is a parasite simply from looking at them. The only way that Shinichi is able to tell is because Migi is actually able to naturally sense other parasites And so, you know, he's able to tell Shinichi, oh, there's a parasite over there. There's a parasite over there. So I liked, you know, the way the story developed overall. I thought it was very thoughtful. If I had a major criticism of the story, that would be the romantic elements of it. There is a girl in this series, I think her name is Murano Satomi, and she's easily the weakest character in this entire series. Her entire purpose for existing is in order for Shinichi to have a romantic interest. And she just isn't that interesting a character. And what I kind of found a bit, you know, quote-unquote hilarious is the fact that as time goes on, the series almost becomes like a harem. There's another girl that falls in love with Shinichi, and there's another girl, very unimportant actually. She appeared far less in the series than I actually expected her to. I thought when she was introduced that she might reappear quite frequently. But she also fell in love with Shinichi. So at one point, there was 3 girls all in love with Shinichi. And I just thought that was a bit of a strange way for the story to develop. I definitely consider it to be the weakest part of the story. And in fact, I can specifically say that Volume 4, which mainly dealt with the love triangle between these 2 girls that are both in love with Shinichi, was the weakest volume of the series overall. I didn't enjoy it as nearly as much as most of the other volumes. I thought that it was pretty poorly handled, and I just think that it could have been handled better. And it may be even better if it was completely excised. Now, that brings me on to the ending, which there's a couple of things I need to discuss about the ending. The ending I'd heard criticism of before for being too preachy, particularly in its anime incarnation. Now, I haven't seen the anime, so I can't comment on, you know, how it's handled in the anime. All I can comment is how it's handled in the manga. It was less preachy than I expected it to be. It was a little preachy, I will give that. A bit about, you know, human nature, human dignity, etc., what a human should do and be able to do. And, you know, it wasn't exactly the most subtle thing, but, you know, it wasn't flat out telling, you know, what humans should be, etc. I thought it was still like open enough that it was kind of a discussion more rather than them just flat out telling you. The romantic element does kind of justify itself in the end. The fact that the ending works so well is pretty much reliant on the fact that there is romantic elements in the series. But that's pretty much the only time in the entire series that I felt that the romantic element actually justified itself. For the rest of the series, I just thought that the romance was generally poorly handled, and I didn't enjoy them. So just because of the fact that it was decently handled in the ending, and actually worked to complete Shinichi's character development, doesn't necessarily justify its inclusion in the rest of the series. So if I had to say the story, I found it engaging, very interesting, thought-provoking, but I was quite disappointed with its romantic elements. I thought those were easily the weakest part of the series, and it's what dragged down my enjoyment of the series significantly. Now, discussing the artwork in it, the artist for this is Hitoshi Iwaaki, which I believe this was his first series, but it's actually really well drawn. First of all, let me just explain. At first, I was having difficulty being able to tell what made this manga look distinct from other manga. Like, it clearly did. If I show you like what the art looks like, I was staring at that for several volumes, and I was trying to figure out to myself, you know, what is it about this series that looks so different from other manga series? And then I kind of realized, beyond the fact that it has the seinen proportions, you know, like the smallish eyes, etc., I noticed it was a lot more line work, a lot more straight lines than is generally in manga. Like, when I look at manga, think of manga, I generally think of rounded edges, you know, like the rounded hair, rounded eyes, rounded chins. But if you look closely at characters in this, you'll see that even the hair, which would generally be rounded, is actually like made up of straight lines, and like their eyes are made up of straight lines, and, you know, their jaw shapes are made up of straight lines, and like even their clothing and their arms are made up of straight lines, which I find like it gives it a very unique look. It's subtle, but very unique looking. Like, it has a nice visual style. That isn't applicable to everything. In particular, I think that really contrasts with the parasites themselves, because the parasites themselves are very curved. And that the fact that they're so curved in comparison to these straight-lined humans only seems to accentuate how different these creatures are from humans. You know, they're so smooth and, you know, fluid moving that, you know, they're completely unhuman. You know, they're the complete opposite of human, which is a very nice and subtle way to, you know, be able to explain how different these creatures are, simply from how smooth the parasites are to how straight-lined the humans are. Now, there's decent detail in the backgrounds in general. There's a lot of use of negative spacing, but I find that it's pretty well handled in general. Like, I never looked at it and thought to myself, oh, I think he should have drawn in a background. The backgrounds that are handled there are pretty nicely detailed, have a nice bit of style, and I thought the negative spacing was used sparingly enough and in enough, you know, effectiveness that it didn't detract at all from my enjoyment of the art. So from an artistic perspective, I would have to say that I quite like the series. It looks pretty nice. The other thing I wanted to point out about Hitoshi Iwaaki, which I find really, really fascinating, is his absolute skill at movement in the series, at being able to convey movement. It's absolutely amazing. I just have to put that out. If there's anything that I respect Hitoshi Iwaaki for being able to do as an artist, it's that ability to be able to convey the movement of things on the page, whether they be using, you know, the speed lines, to the simple way that the parasites themselves curve. He is absolutely sensational at being able to convey movement in the series, which, considering how heavily reliant the series is on movement, is an absolute blessing. So I have to commend his ability. I honestly cannot think of another mangaka who has been able to convey movement so easily and effortlessly as Hitoshi Iwaaki. Now, having said that, the other thing that would have been able to convey movement pretty well, which he is not able to really handle too well in this, maybe due to the fact that this was one of his first manga series, is paneling. As you know, I'm very much a proponent for dynamic paneling, but this series really does not have that much dynamic paneling. Now, the paneling itself is decently varied, to the point where it's never repetitious, and from that aspect, it's good. But there's a lot of moments that I noticed in this series which I thought could have benefited from being a lot more dynamic. It would have been able to convey the movement a lot better. The impact of it is far lessened due to Hitoshi Iwaaki's skill at being able to convey movement through, you know, his art alone. But I do think that this series overall would have had some benefit from just having a bit more dynamic paneling. Not as heavily hit as other series. And beyond that, then I guess I should talk about Kodansha's treatment of the series. So it's a standard tankobon size. If I get out my trusty Yotsuba, you will see that it is exactly the same trim size as Yotsuba. So yeah, normal standard tankobon trim size. This is actually based on a re-release that they re-released in Japan. So originally Parasyte was 10 volumes, but this has been reduced to 8 for the English edition and for the original re-release in Japan. And therefore, each volume is actually decently chunky. They're about maybe 280 pages per volume, which, considering that I bought them for about the same price as I would get for a normal tankobon, that means you're getting pretty good value for, you know, purchasing it. Now, the drawback to this value is the fact that the actual pages themselves are pretty thin in comparison to normal, you know, manga tankobons. Not overly thin, you know, not the point where page bleeding is, you know, overly annoying, but I definitely did notice a lot more page bleeding in this series than I do in normal tankobons, which, you know, I do wish that Kodansha had, you know, just put in normal standard tankobon pages. But, you know, it wasn't overly annoying. It's just worthy of actually taking note of. The actual page whites are pretty good, so I can definitely recommend it from that perspective. The translation itself is good overall. There's some really nice translation notes. The one thing I do need to mention, it isn't too frequent, but it is frequent enough that it is worth mentioning, and that is there are a couple of typos. Every so often words repeating themselves, words being misspelt. I did find that a little annoying overall, but, you know, it's infrequent enough that it didn't really impact my enjoyment too much, just barely enough that it is worth mentioning. And then the other thing to mention is that there is a little bit of extras in these tankobons. These extras are essentially just Hitoshi Iwaaki just answering letters. So basically, readers send in letters to Hitoshi Iwaaki. Maybe they're just giving a statement on their enjoyment of the series. Maybe they're asking a specific question, and Hitoshi Iwaaki, you know, answers it. And, you know, it's a pretty nice little extra. It isn't, anything particularly major, but it's nice to hear the mangaka's, thoughts and opinions on, other people's thoughts, which I really liked. So I really did enjoy reading those little things. And then there's kind of like I wouldn't exactly say it's an afterword. It's in the final volume. There's actually a piece written by a critic, a literary critic, praising Parasyte as one of the best manga he read and giving his reasons why. And that was another very interesting read. Overall, Kodansha have done a pretty good job releasing this series. I believe that the translation itself, though, is actually based on what Del Rey did, but considering that Kodansha essentially bought out the Del Rey manga publishing, that's to be expected. So overall, Parasyte, what did I think of it? I enjoyed Parasyte. Did I enjoy it as much as I expected to? No. The romance bit, the romantic triangles, really brought down my enjoyment of the series. But overall, I did enjoy the series. This series was quite thought-provoking. There was some really nice art. I was particularly impressed with the ease that Hitoshi Iwaaki is able to make his characters move. And I just really enjoyed the series overall. I can actually quite recommend it. I can see why so many people really like it. I just do wish that Hitoshi Iwaaki had either removed or, fixed up the romance elements of it. But I wouldn't let that stop you from picking the series up. It is well worth it, particularly at the cheap prices that I mentioned that Kodansha is releasing them for now. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to comment, rate, subscribe, and bye-bye.